Thanks for joining us for an Every Nation Sunday sermon. This message is from our Hammersmith congregation. For more information on our church, or to see how you can be involved, please visit everynation.co.uk.
Friends, what does it mean to be human? What makes us human beings? I know this might seem like a simple question in the beginning. What do you mean? I mean, we have rocks, we have plants, we have animals, and then we have us as human beings. We are the pinnacle of creation. We are on top of the food chain, as this guy knows. And that used to be the way we look at things. And it seems simple enough, but one of the things that we found out in recent years is that we're actually not on top of the food chain. There are these things called bacteria and viruses, and they're constantly trying to eat us. And we spend half our lives defending ourselves against them. They are actually on top of the food chain. So biologically, it's very difficult to define what does it mean to be human. Well, then what about philosophy? And maybe this famous statement by René Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And just this idea that if you're able to think, surely that must define you as a human being, the fact that you have a conscious and awareness. You not only think, but you can think about the things that you've thought. Now again, the problem with that is twofold. Number one, we know of a lot of animals that come dangerously close to that. And number two, of course, anybody who's ever seen Terminator knows what the problem is. What if we, and I'm just going to assume for the sake of argument everybody has seen it, what if we could create machines, robots, that look like us? They have a computer as a brain that works for all intents and purposes like our brain, that processes information. Maybe we could even give them something that simulates feelings. And so they would look like us, they would walk and talk like us, they would behave like us. For all intents and purposes, they'd be like us. Would we still call them human beings? And if not, why not? So you see, it's a little more complicated than we originally think. I don't know if you followed the news in these last couple of weeks, but Elon Musk, the guy who started Tesla and a few other programs, and Mark Zuckerberg, the guy who started Facebook, had a bit of a clash over this idea of artificial intelligence, and that's going to be a question that future generations will have to really make up their minds on. Richard Dawkins, sort of our friend and atheist, he draws it all together. He takes the robotic, he takes the biological, the philosophical, and he brings it down to one point of what he believes as an atheist. Humans are just moist robots. Nothing more, nothing less. That seems to be just all that there is. Okay. Now you might say, Julian, thanks for that, very educational, but it's not really the kind of thing that I concern myself with. What makes us human? I mean, what kind of question is that? This is not really relevant to me. Now I just want to say to you, the ramifications of us getting this wrong can be nothing short of catastrophic. The ramifications of us not properly understanding what it means to be human can be absolutely terrible. For us as persons and for us as a wider society, as a human race. Now, one of the things that the Nazis did when they first invaded Germany and from there the rest of Europe is they had an ideology by which they classified races. And some races were on top, they were properly human, and then some races were down on the bottom and they were barely, if at all, human. And once you decide that a certain group of people is something between animal and humans, of course, then you can just treat them like that. Of course, you can then dispose of them. And that is exactly what happened. It is not just what happened with the Nazis. I mean, some of you know this guy here, Thomas Jefferson. He was in charge when the Declaration of Independence was signed. And it starts with these beautiful words, and some of you may know that. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now that's wonderful, but Thomas Jefferson had about 100 African-American slaves in his cotton farms. How does he combine those two things? Well, he had a good understanding of what it means to be human, it just didn't include everybody. What he meant is, all men who are like me, white and male, are men. And they are created equal and they enjoy all these rights, but others don't. And again, it's a problem if we don't have the right understanding of what it means to be human. Some of you will have learned in their history, high school or wherever, of these terrible, tragic incidences when when slaves were brought in ships from Africa to the US, and some of those ships sank. And then newspaper articles that would say, ship sank, 10 people died, and then somewhere down there it would say, and 500 slaves died too. It's absolutely tragic. It's terrifying, wouldn't you agree, if you get that one wrong? But what if, it's all in the past, isn't it? We have grown up now. We now know how to do that better. We love equality all across the board. We don't do these kind of things anymore. Well, what about abortion? Which some consider the greatest genocide of all times. Because again, what happens is you define that which happens in a mother's womb is not a human being. It's just a cluster of cells. And that's, once you have that definition, it's no problem to dispose of that without even having a guilty conscience. So you see, again, have I made my point? Do you want me to go on and ramble on a little bit about just the atrocities that have been committed from the Roman Empire that was drowning their children, all the way to a modern Iceland that is now eradicating Down syndrome by effectively having aborted every single child with Down syndrome? The world is a dark place, friends. And one of the big problems that we have is that we do not understand what it means to be human. So, and as we ask ourselves this question, what does it mean to be human? What makes us human? We're right tracking with this guy called King David. As many of you know, King David was a king of Israel, lived about 900 to 1,000 years before Jesus lived. And he was writing a lot of poems, and they are called Psalms, and you find them in the Bible. And one of the Psalms from which we draw a little bit today is Psalm 8. And you can almost imagine the scene. Okay, David in his palace, he's just had a nice dinner, he's walking out, there are the gardens, and it's one of those nice warm evenings, and he's looking around, he sees sort of how vast his kingdom is, and then he looks up and he sees the night sky and the Milky Way, and he says, "Oh Lord, how great are you?" And then he just goes into a bit of a riff for the first 4 verses about praising God for his creation. And then he shifts gears and he asks himself, what is man that you are mindful of him? What does it mean to be human, and why would that in any way be special to you? What is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man, that you would care for him? He then goes on to say in verse 5, "Yet you have made him just a little lower than yourself and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, whatever passes the paths of the seas." And when you read these kind of things in the Bible, you'll ask yourself the question, have I seen a verse like this before? Does that remind me of something? You'll see this has Genesis 1 written all over it. Okay, so David, when he's asking himself the question, what does it mean to be human? What he's immediately thinking is Genesis 1. And the way Genesis 1 works is that it says, "And God created humans in his image." In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and he said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish and the sea, and over the birds of the air, and every living thing that moves upon the earth." So when David is thinking, what does it mean to be human? He's immediately thinking, image of God. We are created in the image of God. That is the biblical definition. That's a biblical answer of what makes us human and why is it so special, so unique? Why is there any value attached to the fact that we are human beings? Now, there are 2 things as we move back to Psalm 8 that I want to draw out a little bit this morning. And the first thing is this idea here. You have made us, human beings, a little lower than yourself, and you have given us glory and honor. We're just going to call that value. The value, the Bible, the value that God attaches to us as human beings. And then we're going to look about this whole dominion thing, and we're going to call it vocation, because both start with V, and if they start with the same letter, you know your preacher's on the right track. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about those 2 things, value and vocation. What does it mean to be human? I'm going to tell you a little story, and before I do this, you guys know Steve. Most of you know Steve. He's Steve Johnson. Yes, that's the one. He's with us on our staff team. He's currently on David's tent, but he not only has one blog, he has two blogs. Okay. One is called makariosblessing.blogspot.co.uk. Write that down. Okay, we're going to help him find a better domain at some point. And his second one is called darknesstolight.me. Now that's pretty cool. And Steve has loads of inspiring stories, and I'm just going to take one of the stories. He has bequeathed that one to me. And so I'm going to tell you that. Anyway, so the story goes like this. Okay, there's this guy, and he owns this ancient old car. And it's basically a pile of rubbish. Okay, you can barely identify it as a car. There are no more wheels. There's nothing that works. There is something that used to maybe be the engine. We're not entirely sure. So it has bumps everywhere. It's just not very pleasant. It's a mess. It looks terrible. And he thinks, what can I do with it? I can't restore it. So I'm just going to sell it. And he decides to sell it for about £50 back in the day. That was quite a bit of money. So he thinks maybe £50. That's roughly what I get for the scrap metal. And then one day a guy shows up and says, I'm interested in possibly buying your car. And he shows him the car, and the guy looks around, looks at every sort of inch of the car, inspects it closely, puts away some of the dust and even the rust, and eventually he says, yeah, I'd like to buy that car. And the owner says, he seems really keen, so I wanted to get 50, maybe I can even get 70 out of him. So he goes all in, he says, I want £70 for the car. And the guy said, yeah, I'm going to pay that. So he buys the car changes owners, it's being transported to its new owner, and the guy is just stoked that he was able to sell off that piece of scrap metal for £70. Now, a couple of months later, he wakes up in the morning, he opens his newspaper, he pours his coffee, and he reads in the newspaper that the car that he had sold to the guy had just been auctioned for 1.5 million. 1.5 million. Now what has happened is that the guy who bought the car, he found an imprint in the car that showed that this was one of the first cars that had ever been built, way before mass production had begun. So it was one of the first cars ever built, and they gave it a tremendous value. And then he was able to restore it, and it looked really pretty, and he was able to auction it off for almost an infinite amount more than what he had paid for it. Here's the point, friends. You carry the imprint of God, and that is what makes you valuable. God has imprinted himself, his image, into you, and that's what gives you value. And maybe there are some of you here this morning, and you're thinking, my life is like a pile of just crap, of just scrap metal. Nobody can restore that. Well, you carry the image of your Creator, and that's what gives you value, that nobody can take away, no matter how bruised and bumped up and messed up this car of your life is, okay? No matter what has happened to you, no matter what has been spoken over you by your parents, by your colleagues, by your friends, no matter who's tried to take that humanness away from you, it's not possible to take it away. That imprint of your Creator will never go away. And that gives you a value that far exceeds anything that you could ever imagine. And that's the point where we can say, moist rowboat's my ass, okay? We have been imprinted by our Creator, and that gives us an infinite amount of value. A couple of weeks ago, Jenna and I went to Bath, just for a little weekend break. And we decided to just, save a little bit of money, not to stay in a hotel, so we stayed in a guest house. And we found this amazing guest house. It's called Bloomer's House, and the guy who owns it, this is Robert. And we had some nice time there in Bath, and then we slept there, and we had breakfast in the morning, and we came down. It was a beautiful day. We brought our books and our journals and our Bibles to have a bit of quiet time after breakfast. And we sat down in the breakfast room, and then the owner himself came to serve us, and he looked at it. He looked at us. He looked at the books we brought, and he said, "Hey, what are you guys reading?" And it's one of those moments where you can feel the whole room like getting quiet, and everybody listening in and looking, okay, what is happening? And so I said, books. And now journals. I said, okay. And then Jenna, who's much bolder than I am, said in a loud voice, and our Bibles. It wasn't awkward. It didn't turn him off. As a matter of fact, he was so excited about it. He came and he said, that's amazing. He doesn't know many people probably that read the Bible, let alone relatively young people. And he sat with us until 2 p.m. And we were just chatting. He's such an inspiring guy. Awesome. He's one of the first guys, by the way, that started the farmers market. He is apparently the first who started the farmers market movements. So all of you who like to go to farmers markets in the UK, he's the guy who started it. Okay, inspiring guy. Anyway, loads of social businesses going on, and we connected over that as well. But as we could have already tell by sort of the look of his house, there's a lot going on. Okay, so there is a certain hippie-ness about it, and there is also a modernness. Like there is an electric car in the front with an electric, charging station and so on. So really a mix of influences, a mix of ideas. And as he then shared with us, he loves Christianity as much as he loves any other religion. Loves all of them. And he was just talking about, the universe and all these kind of things. And as he was talking, it's one of those moments where you're just on the inside praying, Holy Spirit, just help me say something sensible. Help me just to say something that doesn't conform with his already narrow-minded image of those Christians. But what can I say that really challenges him? And then he was particularly impressed with Islam. He was a free spirit, but he was really impressed with Islam. And he said, he told us a story that he met a guy, and he's saying 50 prayers a day. Can you imagine 50 prayers, like breath prayers? He's thanking the universe for food, for air, and for all these kind of things. And then the Muslim guy told him, well, actually, did you know that Allah wanted us to say 50 prayers as well? But then Muhammad was able to persuade him that that's a little too much, and so he haggled him down to 5, and those are the 5 prayers that Muslims are saying every day now. And I was just rambling on about how amazing Islam is. And at that point we said to him, do you know what Islam means? The word. And he didn't know, so we said to him, it means submission. And everything in Islam is geared towards submission, is geared towards you beating yourself into submission to the will of your God. And how does that square with your idea of free living and of freedom that you value so much? And I said to him, Christianity is different. In Christianity, we are being taught that we're created in the image of God. God already had enough angels. He didn't want to create more of those. If he wanted, he could have, but he didn't. He wanted something different. He wanted human beings. He wanted us in his image. And so he created us to be with him, to have a real relationship with him, to partner with him, to co-create with him. The whole idea that he created us in his image means that we are created to create through our choices, through our thinking, through our words. We're creating worlds around us. We are seeing things in a vision, and through decisions and through planning and through action, we're able to create the very thing that we're seeing. Isn't that exciting, friends? But that is a vision of humanity that you'll only find in this way in Scripture. And then I showed him his garden, and his garden was beautiful. And there were some trees surrounding us, like a forest in the background. And I said to him, look, it's beautiful, this forest. That's what God created. But this garden, only human beings can create. And that is the partnership that God wants with us. He's giving us raw material. He's giving us opportunities. He's giving us a point from which we can start, and he's enabling us with gifts, with excitement, with vision, with abilities and skills to create something utterly beautiful and phenomenal in a way that only human beings can. And again, that is the kind of vision that you won't find in any religion. That's the kind of vision you won't find if you think that we're just moist robots. It's the kind of vision you'll only begin to understand when you realize that we are made in the image of God. And it carries with it that tremendous value. So far, so good? Guys, we're doing really good time-wise. Take a minute, share with your neighbor one thing you've learned so far while I drink some water, and then we'll pick it back up. What are human beings? That God, you would be mindful of them. Now, we've talked about value. Now let's talk a little bit about vocation. This idea that God has created this amazing cosmos, and he has put every living thing and all of it into our care. He has put us in this place of dominion over all these things. Now, how does that work? What is sort of the thought behind this? why and what's the point of this? The idea is that of a temple. How is that? Well, the setting is what we call paradise. Genesis calls it paradise. Paradise is an ancient Babylonian word, and it means temple garden. It means the place that belonged to a temple. And this is what ancient teaching was, that there were two spheres, heaven and earth, and they were made for each other. And they were made to belong together, to click in with one another, to connect. And the place where they're supposed to connect, the place where heaven kisses earth, the place where it all meets, where God and human beings would meet, that place would be called a temple. And the Garden of Eden, the paradise, is sort of the archetype of a temple. Now, I know we often don't get that because we're so busy arguing over whether or not it's really been 7 24-hour periods in which God created all of this. And so we're missing this whole idea that this is the place where heaven and earth are supposed to meet, and this is where God and human beings dwell. Now, again, how do you do this, okay? You build a temple, you put the structure in place, and you put all the tools that serve in this temple, you assign all these functions, and then the last thing you do when you build a temple is you put in a statue of whatever God this temple is dedicated to right into the center of the temple. And the point of the statue is this, that whoever walks past this temple or comes into contact with it knows what kind of God rules here. Now, the God is not the statue represents the God. And the rule, this is the big idea, the rule of this God is being reflected into the wider community through the statue of this God. And that's the way that the authors of Genesis 1 arranged the original story, by simply saying this beautiful garden that God created is the place where he wanted to be with us, where he wanted to meet human beings. And they were supposed to be his living statues. They were supposed to be the ones through whom his love, goodness, kindness, his stewardship, his care for this universe would be expressed. It would be shown, it would be radiated, it would be reflected into this wider world through those human creatures that carry his image, through those living statues. So that's the big idea behind this whole statue, behind us being put in dominion over this world. We are supposed to rule over all of creation, not by imposing our rule on it, but by reflecting the love and care and kindness of God. Now let's just pause for a second and ask ourselves, how are we doing on this one? How well we as a human race, and I'm not pointing any fingers, I'm just here trying to reflect and with us think through what kind of job have we been doing so far as living statues of God? If you think of the care that we take of the environment and the way that, we treat the oceans and all of that, the way we've been taking care of animals, the way we've been treating those who are under our dominion, and of course the way we treat ourselves, one another, the way how often have we brought ourselves to the brink of destruction? How often have we just walked a very fine line to some kind of cataclysmic event that we could have brought about with all the modern weaponry that we have, and so on and so forth. So if we take all of that into consideration, that we see the beautiful vision that God once had about us, reflecting his glory, his kindness, his goodness into this world and making it such a wonderful, beautiful place. And then the kind of work that we have actually done, we realize one thing. We've probably been worshiping the wrong gods. And as we have worshipped the wrong gods, we have reflected them into the world. Because that is exactly what happens. If we worship instead of God, who is kind and loving and good, if we worship power, if power is the one thing that excites us, if we get up in the morning because we want to climb the ladder and we want to get on top out there and we want to be respected by everybody, and power is the thing that's on our mind, then on our path to power, we will leave a trail of destruction that will hurt a lot of people, provide a fruitful ground for more darkness, and will make this world an infinite worse place than it was before. If we worship sex, we'll end up in every way seeking that sort of pleasure, and it will start with pornography. It will go on and go on until it leads to idolatry and adultery, and before you know it, you're breaking up families, you're hurting people around you, not least your own family, and again, you're making this world a dark place because you're worshiping the wrong God. if we're worshipping ourselves, if we're putting ourselves up there, and we think that we are the beginning and end of it all, it just, again, it makes the world a dark place, because all we care about is ourselves, and that's no way to go about stewardship and caring and loving and serving others. Here's an almost universal truth that is good for us to all remember. What you worship, you become. I feel like my little caption sort of ruined my dramatic moment. I'll work on that next time, okay? What you worship, you'll become. Now, it's one thing to worship the wrong gods and reflect their ugliness into the world. It's one thing to worship greed and become every bit, and reflect sort of the ugliness of greed into the world. But the thing is, we'll become every bit as ugly as greed itself. The Bible tells us in Psalm 115, it says, these idols, and idols are nothing else than other gods that we like to worship. They're made of gold and silver, but they have hands, but they cannot. They have mouths, but they cannot speak. They have eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but they can't hear. They have noses, but they can't smell. And then it says, those who make them are just like them. So those who make those idols, they have eyes, but they can't see the truth anymore. They have ears, but they can't listen to advice anymore. They have hands, but they can't do the right thing anymore. They become every bit as useless, as ugly, and as almost dehumanized as the idols that they're worshipping. And that's the tragic thing about sin. It dehumanizes us. Remember that great vision that God has for us as human beings. Sin, and I don't know of any better way to explain what sin is than this: worshipping the wrong gods and turning into them. Now, often we think of sin in terms of making a bad moral choice, and of course that's part of it, but it's bigger than that. The problem is much deeper than that. We're worshipping the wrong gods, and we're reflecting them into the world. What can we do, friends? What can we do then? Is this already a hopeless place? What can be done about this? Can we just turn around and worship God? I mean, is it as simple as that? No, it's not. Why? Because we don't know God. What is God like? Who is he? What are his attributes? Now, we read about them, but it's one thing to read that God is love, and a whole different thing to know what that means and what that means for me and how to apply that in my life. Yeah, friends, if only we had somebody who knew how that all works and who could live that out and practically show us what it means to be the image of God. And as we ask ourselves that kind of question, we're tracking right with the thoughts of Paul, one of the New Testament authors. And he's writing in Colossians, but also in a lot of other places, 1 Corinthians in particular, about Jesus, the perfect image of God. And when he says image, he doesn't just mean Jesus represents God really well here. What he means is all the implications. Those are all the implications of Genesis 1 that we've just spoken about. All of that is imported and pressed and combined into that one statement that Paul makes here. Jesus is the perfect image of God. He is the visible image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. And now that we understand that, we also understand the next thing. To become like Jesus means to become fully human. You want to live up to all the humanity, to the great vision of humanity that God has placed inside of us. You want to experience all the value that God has imprinted on you when he imprinted his image. You want to live like that. You can only do that by becoming like Jesus. And I know that sounds a little bit like Jesus. Well, I don't really want to be that guy, like living back then and then dying for us. It's not really the kind of vision I have for my life. But think it through, friends. Let's think about just who this amazing Jesus is. If you think of it in terms of just the creativity that he has had. Okay, nobody did what Jesus was able to do. In 3 years of ministry, he turned the world upside down, and the world has been a different place since. Now, I've been in ministry for 5 years. The world has not shaken yet. But Jesus has in 3 years accomplished what nobody else could ever accomplish. Or think of it in terms of uniqueness. Nobody was as unique as Jesus. When you say the term Jesus, nobody would confuse him with this other Jesus guy. Everybody knows who you're talking about. Jesus is just a perfect example of somebody living up to all the humanness, all the vision of humanness, the dream of the great possibility of man that God has put into us. And so as we want to live a life full of God's goodness, full of God's love and mercy, full of God's joy, full of God's patience, and as we want to reflect that into this world, there is only one thing we must do. Fix our eyes on Jesus. And I know this might come a little bit like I don't want to say downer, but maybe you feel a little betrayed right now because you followed me through all these arguments, elaborate arguments of how difficult it is if we get our humanness wrong and then the statue thing. And now we look at the brokenness of this world and now the solution is as simple as that. Surely the solution must be some elaborate, at least 12 steps of action. Okay, you can start by doing this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and so on and so forth. But part of us being created in the image of God also means that we're able to think things through on our own. And the one thing that we all can and need to do is grow up in thinking those things through for ourselves. And so the one thing, and again, it seems crazy how simple it is. It seems crazy that all this elaborate talk has brought us now to this point that we seem to have already known from the beginning. Let's fix our eyes on Jesus. And just note here, it says, fix your eyes, not occasionally glance at him. Constantly fix your eyes on Jesus. And as we do that, two things will happen. Okay? As we look at him, we become like him, we worship him, and we are being restored. Remember the car. We are being restored and remade. The image has not been lost. The imprint is still there, and we are being restored as we look at him. As we look at him and as we fix our eyes on him. And then we also reflect him into this world as we do that. Okay? Think of the moon. You see that part of the moon at night, which is turned to the sun. And if it's fully turned to the sun in the right position, you see a full moon. And in the same way, I want us, friends, to fully be able to reflect all of God's love and his goodness into this world. And we can only do that by fixing our eyes on Jesus, keeping them fixed. And then this statement, isn't it beautiful? Our faith comes from him, and he is the one who makes it perfect. Everything else that will follow will sort of follow on its own because the Holy Spirit will come to your aid. As you make a decision to fix your eyes on Jesus, the Holy Spirit rushes to your aid and says, let me help you. Make sure you don't look at the wrong gods again. Let me help you. Make sure that as you fix your eyes, you're being transformed and renewed. Your humanness comes out in a whole new way, and the life that I want to place inside of you can flourish in a whole new way.